Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Asad Ijaz Bhatt on Naya Daur TV on political economy. This week, we come to you every week with a new guest, with a new topic, but mostly focused on politics and economy in Pakistan. Today, I have a very exciting guest with me. Gonzalo has been in Pakistan with the World Bank for about 4 or 5 years. Gonzalo would throw some light on his tenure in Pakistan also, and has done some exciting work, including a recent report that I have in my hand here, which is called From Swimming in Sand to High-End Sustainable Growth. I attended the launch of this report and was really fascinated by the breadth of research that went into it and some of the policy proposals that were made for the interest of policymakers in Pakistan. So we decided to do a follow-up session, an interview with Gonzalo, and talk about, not just this report, but his vision on Pakistan and, what are the big economic problems that he's witnessed in Pakistan and what are the solutions really. So I'd welcome Gonzalo to the show. Hi, Gonzalo.
Hello, Asad. Thank you so much for the invitation.
How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you.
How's been your time in Pakistan? Loving it?
Extremely enriching. I learned a lot. I've been here for about 4 years now, and it has been a very enriching experience, lots of learning.
You've really contributed to Pakistan, and I know people in the policy circles in Islamabad, economists really value your contributions to the country. But Gonzalo, without wasting any time, I would like to jump to the report and try to learn from you what are the main proposals in the report. But I was really fascinated about a few things, including the focus on productivity. This has been a neglected area in Pakistan. Some policymakers have pointed to low productivities in various sectors. So but then again, the government hasn't really focused on enhancing productivity and trying to sort of capitalize on the productivity gains, especially in the agriculture and infrastructure related sectors. So Gonzalo, when you say productivity, are you just focusing on capital productivity because you talk a lot about firms, or are you also talking about labor productivity?
Okay, so thank you for the question. I'm talking about both things, and perhaps let me start by saying, if you look at last 30 years,
Yes.
the last 30 years saw an increase in what we call labor productivity. So how much value an average worker in Pakistan adds. What we saw was that in the past 30 years, that increased by 40%. So labor productivity increased by 40%. If you compare that to what happened in Vietnam, same period, in Vietnam, labor productivity increased by 330%. So by almost 8 times faster. But before we get into the, what should you do to change that situation, perhaps it's worth thinking about what is it that productivity means. And that goes to your question, is it labor, is it capital productivity? Productivity is sort of an abstract concept. So if one talks about productivity, the average person will say, what does that have to do with me? But actually, productivity has a very concrete implication. Productivity is very much related to the incomes that households get. If you're more productive, if you work in an economy that is more productive, your income will be higher. And if you work in an economy that is less productive, your income will be lower. Because productivity at the end of the day is how much value you are creating in your economic activity. So productivity is very much associated with the level of income and therefore with the welfare of households in Pakistan. So that 40% increase over the last 3 decades means that the average wage increased by a similar amount. And the 330% productivity increase in Vietnam means that in Vietnam, the average wage increased by that much, 8 times faster. So it may sound like an abstract concept, but it has very concrete implications for the average household in the country, because it means how much value they are adding and therefore how they are rewarded for that in their paycheck at the end of the month.
Gonzalo, that's a very interesting analysis. But as far as productivity is concerned and transformation in the manufacturing sector is concerned, I've seen many papers comparing Pakistan to Vietnam. Do you think that's a fair comparison? And do you really think, comparing perhaps not just Pakistan, but any developing country to Vietnam would be slightly unfair because, Vietnam, as we all know, has been an outlier of sorts. Do you think it's a fair comparison?
So I do think it's a fair comparison, but let's take one step back and say any comparator that you choose, right?
Yeah.
You can challenge it because no country is the same as other, right? So it's very difficult to make comparisons. We could take the case of Bangladesh, and in Bangladesh over the same period, the labor productivity increased by about 170%, whereas in Pakistan
Yeah.
increased by 40. So you don't need to go to Vietnam to see that there is an issue with productivity in Pakistan that has been stagnant. But I still think that the case of Vietnam is an interesting point of comparison for Pakistan. And I'll tell you why. If you go about 20, 25 years back, and you look at the structure of production of Vietnam, the structure of exports of Vietnam, and you compare it to the structure of exports of Pakistan, what you will see is a very similar structure. So about 80% of exports of Vietnam at that time were textile and apparel, same as in Pakistan. The rest were agricultural goods and minerals, same as in Pakistan. Now, if you fast forward 20 years, 25 years to now, what you see in Vietnam is a complete transformation of the export basket. More electronics.
Yeah.
You still see textiles and apparel. You still see agricultural products, but a lot of electronics. You see computers, microchips, etc. And when you see the structure of
So
Pakistan,
more complex goods, basically.
Not only more complex goods, exactly more complex goods, yes, but also a more diversified export
more
structure.
Diversified, yeah.
Completely
Yeah,
changed. Still exporting textiles and apparel, still exporting rice, still exporting minerals, but also exporting more sophisticated, more complex products. If you fast forward the Pakistan export structure from, comparing 2000 to 2020, 2022, what you see is no change whatsoever. The same textiles and apparel explaining a large portion of exports, rice mainly, but other foodstuffs and vegetables explaining the rest. So yes, Vietnam perhaps was an outlier, but it wasn't all that different in terms of the structure of production 20 years ago. So that brings us to what is it that Vietnam did differently from what Pakistan did, and how distortions basically introduced by policy or unaddressed by policy played a role in that transformation in the case of Vietnam, and played a role in the lack of transformation in the case of Pakistan. So I would say, yes, it may be a little bit of an outlier, but sometimes we learn from what others that have been outliers did, and how can we, the extent to which we can imitate that or not.
Yeah, on that point, Gonzalo, thank you for your answer. You mentioned distortions in the market. Are you basically inferring to the fact that Pakistan's export basket, this export structure, could not diversify over the period of comparison or period of analysis, is because Pakistan was asymmetrically incentivizing sectors like textile, and of course in comparison to other sectors, and those incentives which were moved into some industries and not other industries, is the distortions that you're talking about?
Yes. So perhaps I can give you 3 different types of distortions that have affected not just the composition of production, right, whether it's textiles or electronics as in Vietnam, but also the size of the export basket, and also the size of the productive economy. And in the report, we look at these 3 levels of distortions that basically shape the way in which resources are allocated in Pakistan. The first layer of distortion has to do with the fact that tax policy, in a way, incentivizes resources going into real estate and land as a store of value, rather than into dynamic tradable sectors. And I'll tell you why. You have negligible taxes on property and negligible taxes on land, but you have relatively high income tax on manufacturing sectors or in services sectors that are more dynamic, tradable, etc. So that means that anyone that needs to make an investment decision is going to be more inclined to invest in real estate because it's going to avoid paying taxes there. Whereas if you invest in dynamic tradable sectors, manufacturing, for example, then you have to pay more taxes. So that's a first level of distortions that moves resources to flow into non-tradables, basically real estate, away from dynamic tradables, say manufacturing, say modern services. That's one level. Now, there is still some investment, not much, going into dynamic tradable sectors. But what happens there is a second level of distortions. This, a very peculiar distortion, that is import duties. Pakistan relies heavily on import duties, import taxes. In Pakistan, import duties average about 20%. It places Pakistan among the top 5 countries in the world that most taxes imports. And taxes on imports are tricky taxes. The reason they are tricky taxes is because the name is misleading. You may think you're taxing imports, and yes, you are. That's where the tax is levied, right, on the imports of a particular good. But actually, the effect of those import taxes are discouraging export activities. So the tax on imports, the import duty, acts as an implicit export tax. Why is that? Because, say, for example, if and I will use the example of cheese because many people talk about cheese as, you know, what the elites consume and therefore they should put a high import duty. Okay, fine. You put a high duty on cheese. In fact, the import duties on cheese are about 60%. So what that does is that basically incentivizes producers domestically to produce cheese and sell it in the domestic market because the import duty at 60% discourages imports of cheese, make imports very expensive, right? And so they create extra profits for the domestic company that can sell the cheese domestically without facing import competition. Now, the other thing that these import duties do is, because this firm now will have incentives to sell domestically, it will not export. It will only export after it has exploited completely the domestic market, after it has saturated the domestic market. And this is why in Pakistan, people talk about the export surplus. The reason why they talk about the export surplus is that export surplus is there not, is because high levels of protection, high levels of import duties make it highly profitable to sell domestically. So a high import duty discourages exports. So the little investment that goes into dynamic tradables actually ends up focusing in tradables, but for the domestic market, not for export markets. And the limited investment that ends up in the export market, and you see that there were 2 layers already that are discouraging exports, right? But the little that ends up going to exports nonetheless are further discouraged from diversifying into new export products by a third level of distortions that has to do with export incentives. Export incentives in Pakistan have been concentrated. One could say captured, but let's call them concentrated in the textile and apparel sector. If you look, for example, at credit subsidies that were given to exporters by SBP schemes like LTFF or EFS, they are disproportionately targeting textile and apparel. So textile and apparel got a lot of benefits from these subsidies. Similarly, DLTL, that is another export incentive that Ministry of Commerce runs, was heavily tilted in favor of textiles and apparel. So that means that if you want to produce something new and export something new, you're basically missing out on subsidies. And so you won't do it. So in a way, policies, distortive policies, were shaping or were ensuring that that export basket never diversified, right? So you had those 3 layers. The tax policy that had really, really negligible taxes on real estate, that is making resources flow to real estate instead of dynamic tradables. Within those resources that went into dynamic tradables, high import duties that make resources flow into domestic-oriented activities like import substituting activities rather than export-oriented activities. And the little that goes into export-oriented activities, you have an infrastructure around export incentives that focuses on textiles and apparel. So it's making sure that that export structure never diversifies. So there you have 3 layers that are shaping the way the economy looks now and the way the economy looked 20 or 30 years ago.
Gonzalo, thank you for a very elaborate response and for explaining what you mean by distortions. In my discussions with some policymakers, both inside and outside Pakistan, uh, the fears that they express is that if they liberalize the import market, which means that they minimize it's a very even subsidization and incentive regime, and they remove all import substitution type policies. Their fear is that these 30 billion exports that Pakistan makes, primarily 60 or 70% of which come through the textile sector, would mean that there would be a lag, and for the first 4 or 5 years, until other sectors pick up pace, these textile exports would also be gone, and Pakistan would be running huge current account deficits. What are your thoughts on that?
So,
is there a risk?
The analysis that we've done and that others have done show that that is not the case, and I'll tell you why. So on the export sector and those that are already exporting, reducing import tariffs doesn't do much for those that are already exporting. The only channel that is linking import tariffs with that export performance of those already exporting is the fact that they will have access to better intermediates and to better capital equipment, so better machineries, so that they will be able to use better technologies, and so they will be able to export more because they will be more competitive. In fact, something that we know from international experience is that access to good quality intermediates from wherever they are produced, access to good quality technologies from wherever they are produced, is something that boosts productivity and therefore also boosts export performance. Now, the most important channel that links import duties to exports is actually on those firms that are not yet exporting. And what lower import duties do is they give incentives for firms to move away from the domestic market and into the export market. So on the export side, what we see when we look at data and when we look at international experience is that lower import duties will increase the size of the export pie. Where the concern comes is what is going to happen with import competing sectors. So if you decrease tariffs all of a sudden, you will have more import competition. And that import competition may affect those sectors in Pakistan that are inward looking, that are supplying to the domestic market. So that's where the challenge from a policy perspective lies. And this is why it is very important. The sequence of reforms is very important.
You're talking about the protectionist side of import tariffs, that the nascent local small industry would be affected by it.
Small or large, it's not necessarily small. The auto sector is not small and is highly protected. If you reduce import duties on cars, those are not small firms, but those are going to be affected because they will face more competition domestic. Is that good or bad for productivity? For productivity, it's likely to be good. More competition will be good. Those resources that are held in those sectors are going to be released to sectors that are more competitive, and that's going to increase productivity. But there is a genuine concern for what is going to happen with, say, employment in those sectors. So what other countries that have opened up have done is to sequence reforms in a way in which the outcomes tend to be better. And I'm going to give you a particular example. When Taiwan opened up and when Taiwan opened and changed its model of development away from import substitution and into an export-led growth model of development, the way they did it was, first, they let the exchange rate float. So when the exchange rate floated, it depreciated. So the currency depreciated. And as the currency depreciated, that depreciated currency acts as a barrier, a natural barrier against being flooded with imports. It also acts as an incentive to export more because your exports become cheaper and therefore you're more competitive and the imports become naturally more expensive. So depreciation of the currency is, in a way, a natural shield against imports and a natural boost to your export sector. So when you let the exchange rate float and the currency reaches a level that is competitive, so it depreciates, that is a good opportunity for you to introduce this type of reforms that are productivity enhancing. You can gradually reduce import duties because in a way you're protected by the exchange rate that has depreciated. And that gives you time for domestic industry to adjust to new conditions. So it gives you temporary protection because that depreciated exchange rate gives you that temporary protection.
Okay, so Gonzalo, the other part of the report, I think a large part is of course focused on productivity, and you've very succinctly and nicely answered all my questions on that. There's one part that focuses on females and female labor force participation. Um, in Pakistan, we've seen that there are a lot of cultural constraints to female labor force participation, and gender wage gaps and artificial barriers to entry in the labor market exist everywhere in the world. Do you think that Pakistan's case is peculiar in the first instance, and do you think these cultural constraints could be removed? Is this an economic issue in your eye, or is this more a cultural issue?
Well, it's both, right? It is an economic issue in the sense that, look, the growth of Pakistan has been stunted by its inability to allocate resources, but also by its inability to allocate talent. And when I say
Yeah.
talent, most of this challenge is related to low female labor force participation. You have about female labor force participation rates that are close to 24%. That places Pakistan among the lowest in the world, in the lowest records in terms of female labor force participation in the world. Now, you're keeping a large portion of your population and therefore of your talent outside the labor force. So that is a drag on economic activity. We estimate that if you basically match the levels of female labor force participation that you have in Bangladesh, that is a country that has similar cultural norms as Pakistan, then you would accrue GDP gains of up to 23%. So that basically is almost the size of your economy would grow by about a quarter if labor force participation rates match Bangladesh. I'm not talking about matching Norway. I'm talking about matching Bangladesh, a country that has similar gender norms as Pakistan. So what in a way, yes, there are gender norms. There are gender norms that are cultural, but there are a number of other things that the country could be doing to stimulate the participation of females in the labor market. One of the things that we see when we look at the data of female labor force participation is a U-shaped relationship. So at low levels of income, you have that female labor force participation rates are relatively high. So in a way, poverty trumps gender norms. If you're poor, you have to work. It doesn't matter if you're female or male. You have to work. You have no other option. Now, what happens is that as the income levels of the household in which you're in start increasing, then female labor force participation rates fall. And then in the high income households, so when you're at the top of the income distribution of households, then female labor force participation rates are increasing again a little bit. Yeah. So what that is saying is that there is something in the middle there that is happening. And that something in the middle has a lot to do with employment in manufacturing. Employment in manufacturing is where the challenge is the largest for females. What we see in the data is that female labor force employment in manufacturing is at 4% in Pakistan. 4% is extremely, extremely low. And what happens there is not so much related to gender. I mean, gender norms play a role, but what happens there is that there is an enabling infrastructure that is missing. A key element here is safe transport. So transport infrastructure is crucial for females to be able to go to work. So those that want to go to work, but they don't have access to safe transport, are not going to be able to go to work. And that has nothing to do with cultural norms. That has to do with a lack of public infrastructure when it comes to providing safe transport. And this is why another interesting finding that we have is, as I was mentioning, there is this U-shaped relationship between labor force participation of females and income. Now, when you break that down, districts that have high connectivity and those that have low connectivity, you see that that inverted U shape disappears for high connectivity districts. So what does that mean? What it means is that if you give connectivity, so if you're in districts in which there is connectivity that could be internet connectivity, but also in a way that's a proxy for transport connectivity. More connected districts that are, that have high internet connectivity are also going to be districts that have better transport connectivity. When you have transport connectivity, then women work more. So safe transport is a crucial element to ensure, to boost female labor force participation. But there is a challenge that also employers face. That is what economists call a coordination failure. And I'll explain you what this coordination failure is. You may be an employer, right? And you want to hire women. Now, for you to hire women, you need to set up your plant in a way that you have dedicated restrooms, for example, for females. You may have dedicated spaces for females to work safely in. You're only going to do those adjustments in your plant if you can get a sizable number of females to work for you, not for one, a sizable number.
You need to have a daycare and other facilities also, right? Yes.
Daycare is more sophisticated. Not many have daycare, but let's say dedicated restrooms, dedicated spaces, etc. Dedicated transport. Now, females are not going to be willing to supply their labor, so they are not going to be willing to go and work if those spaces are not available in the factories. But you're not willing to set up those spaces if females are not willing to go to work. So you see, this is a chicken and egg problem. So if someone comes and says, you know what, you mandatorily need to invest in this type of infrastructure, then, and perhaps public policy can help in a way because it could chip in part of the costs, right? Then what we would see is that more females would be offering their labor, more females would be willing to work, and it would be profitable for employers actually to pay for those investments in infrastructure. So that is something that could be done to improve female labor force participation in Pakistan, particularly in manufacturing.
All right, Gonzalo, my last question, and I would appreciate thank you. You've been very patient on this interview, and you've answered all the questions in a lot of detail. So thank you for that. And my last question would be, I would just want a one-line response on that. What do you think is the one big headline thing that the government of Pakistan should do tomorrow to bring Pakistan, on the productivity side, perhaps, where should we start from? And that one thing that the government should do immediately. And do you really think on the IMF side that, Pakistan government should really implement the IMF proposals and implement a stabilization sort of a regime as opposed to, trying to go on a growth path that the governments have continued to do in the past?
One line, if I'm only given one line, what I would say is address
you can take two. You can take two, Gonzalo.
Address the distortions. And when I say address the distortions, I mean ensure you're taxing land and real estate fairly. And that will be the best start so that resources start flowing away from real estate and into dynamic tradable sectors. And once that happens, you will see faster growth, faster productivity gains, and more employment of good quality taking place in Pakistan. Of course, there's much more to do. You gave me one line, so that is what I suggest. Property taxes, consider tax on land seriously done.
Thank you so much for joining me, Gonzalo, and taking out time for this interview. I would also like to particularly thank Musharraf Zaidi and Shahab Siddiqui for coordinating this with you, and the Tabadlat team for launching the report alongside the World Bank. Gonzalo would carry the conversation forward, and thank you for your services to Pakistan and for joining me.
Thank you so much, Asad, for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.